they reported it was 94. 94 degrees in April, and I don't know about you guys, but I just wilted. I'm not ready for 94. And I said, you know, if I wanted to come to this talk after this day, I'd stay home. So I expected it was going to be me and Noreen and Charlie, and that was pretty much it. So thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it. This is a talk that I both care about a lot, and I think it's important because it talks about a time in Connecticut where, for very different reasons, Connecticut had some of the very same problems it has today. It's called Leaving Connecticut, Shaping America, Settling the Western Reserve, which I'll explain shortly, in the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, you could think of it as a prequel to another thing I'm really excited about, and you're so close, I hope that you will take time to go by and see it. It is a new exhibit that's opening next week at the Litchfield Historical Society. It's called To Come to a Land of Milk and Honey, and it is all about people from Litchfield County and from this area who made their way to the Western Reserve in the late 18th and 19th century. So if you want to think of this talk, which is largely about the decision to leave, as an advertisement for that exhibit. I'm certainly going to be there. I expect I'll see it several times. I worked on it with the staff there, and I think there's just a lot to be excited about. So, with that in mind, let me begin. By the way, I know some of you must be struggling after this day. So if at any time you feel like you want to put your head down and snooze, go ahead. If you feel like you want to stay awake but you're just having a desperate time doing it, yell coffee, and then if you say cream and sugar, I'll walk over and I'll bring you. One way or the other, your job is to be comfortable. My job is to tell you this story. And it begins like this. Not too long ago, I spent an uncomfortable evening reading our state's first ever economic strategic plan, a 541-page analysis of Connecticut's economy and what needs to be done to assure that we enjoy a healthy economic future. Among the most troubling of its findings was this. Since 2000, Connecticut has lost a higher percentage of its 25 to 34-year-old population than any other state in the Union. The plan left no doubt as to how serious a problem this loss of young adults to other places is. Connecticut is at a crossroads. It said the workforce is aging as talented young workers are leaving the state and population and job growth are stagnating. One of Connecticut's first priorities moving forward, the report indicated, must be creating an economic climate in which our children and grandchildren can not only afford to live in Connecticut, but will be able to prosper. As sobering as the governor's report was, we can perhaps draw some solace from the fact that this isn't the first time in which Connecticut has faced a crisis over the loss of its young people to other, more hopeful places. A little over 200 years ago, in May of 1817, Connecticut Governor Oliver Wolcott issued a remarkably similar note of concern in his gubernatorial report to the state's General Assembly. An investigation of the causes which produced the numerous emigrations of our industrious and enterprising young men is by far the most important subject which can engage our attention. Connecticut in 1817, as in 2023, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its future, to other, more economically attractive locations. And it had been doing so for a long time. On January 1st, 1801, on the first day of the 19th century, the newly chartered Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences, in its first project as an organization, had sent a circular letter to each of Connecticut's 107 towns, then 107, asking them to provide detailed answers to 113 questions about their town. One of the items of interest to the Academy was emigrations from the town or society. In their responses, most towns left no doubt that outmigration had been a real problem of significant duration. The towns of Haddam and Killingsworth, for example, both reported emigrations from this town have been very numerous. Coventry said, there have been many emigrations from this town to the new countries, so that of late the number of inhabitants has not greatly increased. Farmington, with a population of 2,809 people in the 1800 census, reported that 147 families and 40 or more young unmarried persons of both sexes had left the town for a total loss of 775 people, almost 1/4 of Farmington's population. Durham explained that the reason there's been no more increase of population for many years is that individuals and families have removed almost perpetually to other places. Lebanon reported almost wistfully, and this is really convoluted, on the number of inhabitants it had lost. Emigration for more than 30 years has been so constant, it noted, that it's judged that if all who left the town were still living, and their descendants, and the descendants of those who are dead were to return, they would triple the number of inhabitants. So they're saying we've lost twice as many people as we have. Clearly, Governor Wolcott's 1818 message calling out migration the most important subject which can engage our attention was addressing a real and a serious problem. Now, where, you might ask, were all those people going? Where did the grass look that much greener? Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved a powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was the part of Northeast Ohio stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border and from the 41st degree of latitude to 42 degrees in 2 minutes. A place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is today still known as Connecticut's Western Reserve. This was the part of its original charter lands that Connecticut kept ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. Now, have any of you been out to that part of northern Ohio between Pittsburgh and Cleveland? Looks just like Connecticut, doesn't it?
Names are the same too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many Connecticut names there. I mean, you can really see what happened just watching that. You can't help but be struck by the way that region seems to be, in names, town layout, architecture, virtually a mirror image of Connecticut. It's worth a trip just to go there and see it. It'll make you appreciate what we actually have here all the more. From Clarendon, that Ohio land of steady habits. I don't know if you can read the sign, but the town motto is Clarendon, the land of steady habits. To Hudson, Stowe to Strongsville, the area roughly between Youngstown and Cleveland appears to be nothing less than Connecticut West. But is it? Appearances, especially in a post-colonial revival America, can be, and they often are, deceiving. I've long been curious about the degree to which the first settlers of the Western Reserve transplanted Connecticut's distinctive institutions, culture, and values to their new homeland. Why, I wondered, did people decide to leave Connecticut? What were the push factors driving them out, and the pull factors drawing them to the Western Reserve instead of other places? What was the experience of removal like? Who went? How did they travel? How long and how hard was their journey? And how did the people of Connecticut who stayed behind feel about the emigration of so many of their children? These are questions that I hope in the fullness of time will fill a book. But tonight, let me share with you some of the things I've found so far. What made so many people from the Nutmeg State decide to uproot themselves and their families and head west? Well, generally, it was the same two factors that have propelled much of human mobility in all times and places: the rhyming twins of need and greed. By 1750, much of Connecticut arable land east of the Great River, that's the Connecticut, had been farmed out. Many fields that had once been astonishingly productive were now only as good as fallow periods and limited manure could make them. In addition, everywhere one looked, you saw confirmation that New England's lifestyle had had marvelous effects on old English bodies. Not only had the descendants of the Puritan first-comers lived long and healthful lives, they had obeyed the biblical command to be fruitful and multiply with relish. English immigrants who settled in Connecticut lived twice as long as those who went to Virginia. They lived a decade longer than those they left behind in England. Infant mortality rates were low, marriages early, childbearing years long. The result was a population explosion that left Connecticut fathers scrambling to find sufficient agricultural land to pass on to their many children. Between 1730 and 1760, in a manner that would have made Thomas Malthus smile, Connecticut's population more than tripled, from 38,000 in 1730 to 70,000 in 1749 to over 130,000 by 1760. And on the eve of the American Revolution in 1774, it was close to 200,000. Town populations began to outstrip agricultural capacity. The abundant 150 acres of land granted to the average first-comer was soon whittled down by partible inheritance to just enough land to get by, and then not even that. In the 1730s, as this area attests, the demand for more land was satisfied by the sale of 300,000 acres in the northwest Connecticut hills. But by 1750, the last of the colony's public lands were gone. Meanwhile, in the land of steady habits, no habit was steadier than regularly bearing children. So the need for additional farmland for rising generations became this Connecticut constant. For a long time, this need was partially met, or at least it was intended to be met, by the sale of lands claimed by the newly formed Susquehanna Land Company along the fertile valleys of the Susquehanna River, within the bounds of Connecticut's 1662 charter. It was a huge area the developers called creatively Westmore Land. But the problem was the land claimed by Connecticut was also claimed by Pennsylvania, which led to a generation of intercolonial conflict, sometimes extremely violent, that was ultimately decided in favor of the Keystone State. Land-hungry Connecticutans, especially those who'd served in the expeditions against Canada during the French and Indian War, also were attracted to the northern Connecticut River Valley. There you go. Up the valley, these land-hungry migrants came, bringing their families, possessions, and Connecticut town names with them to Windham, Windsor, Orange, and Essex counties, to create a new Guilford, Pomfret, Hartford, Wallingford, Brookfield, Norwich, Middlebury, Salisbury, Goshen, Bethel, and the list goes on. This desire to carry old Connecticut to new lands was so strong that 25 of the 211 Vermont town names appearing in America's first census, about 1 out of every 8 towns was named after a Connecticut town of origin. So many Connecticutans moved north into this previously unsettled region in the years immediately after the French and Indian War that when the inhabitants assembled to declare themselves on January 15, 1777, to be a free and independent jurisdiction or state, they declared that they were forever hereafter to be called, known, and distinguished by the name of New Connecticut, alias Vermont. For most migrants, of course, Vermont soon proved to be too hilly, too rocky, and way too damn cold. And in the years after the American Revolution, many looked to lands in western New York State, promoted by speculators such as Oliver Phelps of Suffield, who in 1787 contracted to buy over 6 million acres of Genesee County for resale to New England out of his land office in his house in Suffield. These lands were indeed attractive, but the biggest plum in the West were land speculators, would-be settlers, and the people of Connecticut collectively were the 5,000 square miles of territory included in the Western Reserve. Adventuring in lands and procuring inhabitants to settle them was then, as the Connecticut diplomat and profiteer Silas Deane noted, the best branch of business in America. And the agreement Connecticut made with the United States, carving out the Western Reserve from the rest of the Northwest Territory, prompted a decade-long debate over how the reserve land should be sold, who should sell it, and what should be done with the proceeds. Now, the debate took place in the General Assembly of Connecticut. Was their land, and they got to decide what happened. That debate dragged on, no doubt in part because during the decade-long discussion, the Ohio country was a scene of many of the most deadly battles between Indians and whites in American history. Mad Anthony Wayne's decisive victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo in 1794, followed by the Treaty of Greenville the following year, effectively cleared the reserve of indigenous people for white settlement. Simultaneously, the Jay Treaty with England meant the British too would presumably vacate the Northwest. Now, not surprisingly, now that the land was cleared, agreement on how to dispose of the Western Reserve lands by sale was reached that very same year. The reserve was sold in the fall of 1795 for $1,200,000 in notes. You just signed a note that you would pay in the future to the Connecticut Land Company, a syndicate of venture capitalists whose names read to some extent like a who's who of Connecticut's venerable standing order. Edwards, Bull, Griswold, Root, Stoddard, Holbrook, Lyman, Morgan, families whose members had been part of the ruling oligarchy of Connecticut for generations, were thoroughly salted among the names of the newly wealthy. The biggest investor was Oliver Phelps of Suffield, already heavily invested in the Genesee country, who signed on for $168,000 of the debt. The smallest investor, Sylvanus Griswold, put himself on the hook for 1/100th of that amount. A 50-person surveying team led by Moses Cleveland of Canterbury, now you know why it's called Cleveland, was sent out the following spring. And in 1796 and 1797, the Western Reserve was mapped, staked, and made ready for sale. The surveying method Cleveland's party used both copied and departed from that used by the surveyors of the United States Northwest Territory, from which the Western Reserve had been carved out. The grid system employed in the Northwest Territory was used, dividing up the landscape into uniform rectangular lots of equal size, townships that were 6 miles square, subdivided into sections that were 1 square mile each. That's how they did it in the Northwest Territory. The Connecticut Land Company laid out townships the same way, but they were only 5 miles square, also subdivided into sections of 1 square miles. The Connecticut land speculators, unlike the United States government, and this is unusual, they didn't specifically reserve 1 section in each township for the support of public schools. The irony of this, of course, is that when the state of Connecticut originally sold the land, the General Assembly dedicated all proceeds from the sale to support public education, but only in Connecticut. One cannot overestimate the importance of the grid system in the history of America's westward expansion. Laying out distant and unknown lands into packages of the same size and shape turned an irregular and unknown landscape into a standardized commodity that could be bought and sold at standardized prices, located with specificity on a map, and easily exchanged for other parcels of land of the same size and shape by people who never actually laid eyes on. The Western Reserve surveyors began in the southeast corner of the reserve, and they numbered the townships south to north in sequence until they came to Lake Erie. Now, each vertical strip of townships was called a range. Ranges were numbered from east to west. Thus, a prospective purchaser sitting in Lyme or Bloomfield or Barkhamsted could look at a map and see that the land he was being offered in Range 3, Section 13, was adjacent to both Lake Erie and the Ashtabula River, while Range 12, Section 6, was just south of the proposed town of Cleveland and along the Cuyahoga River. The language of range and township became the lingua franca of westward expansion, and letters to and from the reserve are loaded with discussions of the qualities of various places to settle, all described in reference to the grid system. To assure that each investor got a proportionate share of the reserve's better and lesser quality lands, the Connecticut Land Company distributed the surveyed land through a cumbersome lottery system, which resulted in all of the main proprietors gaining land holdings scattered throughout the reserve. An unintended consequence of this mode of distribution was that the subsequent sale of these randomly drawn parcels of land to settlers produced a settlement pattern in Ohio significantly different than the one through which Connecticut itself had been settled. Whereas the most common form of settlement in Old Connecticut had been clustered settlement by congregations in new towns, which later grew and then spread out by hiving off daughter towns, settlement in the Western Reserve was, from the beginning, to be much more individualized and broadly dispersed. Land was usually purchased not by congregations, but by individuals who chose their location based on what they could find out about specific parcels being offered and what they could afford. For many years, the cabin in the clearing, not the inviting village, was the most common sight in Connecticut. In any event, even as the Connecticut Reserve was being made ready for sale, a kind of westward fever had gripped the east. People were on the move, and their direction was toward the setting sun. In early March of 1795, the Connecticut Journal ran a story from Albany, New York, indicating that upwards of 1,200 sleighs loaded with women, children, and furniture coming from the east had passed through this city within 3 days. The current of emigration, it noted, flows incessantly through this city. 2 months later, the Norwich Packet ran a story from Whitestown, New York, that reported that land speculators are everywhere to be found, and the number of honest husbandmen who are moving westward exceeds all calculation. The story estimated that 15 or 20 boats a day, filled with families moving west, passed by Old Fort Schuyler near Lake Oneida. The West, it asserted confidently, will shortly become as populous as the Connecticut Harbor. What was it that drove so many people to leave Connecticut at the beginning of the American era? Certainly, the opportunity to trade a limited parcel of worn-out land for a much larger tract of fertile and virgin soil was primary. One astute observer in 1817 noted the similarities between the Western migrants and the semi-sedentary indigenous groups who had once roamed the land. Americans, he noted, partake in no small degree of the habits of their predecessors, the Aborigines, who, when they have exhausted one hunting ground, pull up stakes and incontinently march off to another, 400 or 500 miles off, where game is plenty. So with honest brother Jonathan, when he's eaten up everything around him and worked his land to skin and bone, and when his house is just on the point of tumbling about his ears, instead of taking the trouble of restoring one or rebuilding the other, he abandons both. and packing up his movables, consisting of his wife and chubby boys in a wagon, whistles himself to the banks of the Ohio. But desire for land is only part of the story. One who reads the many accounts of this epic diaspora carefully soon find a host of other reasons pushing migrants out of Connecticut, even as promoters enthusiastic accounts drew them westward. These additional factors, which built in intensity throughout the early decades of the 19th century, undoubtedly help explain why the stream of immigrants to the Western Reserve became a literal torrent after 1850. To begin with, Connecticut in the early 19th century faced an environmental crisis on several fronts. Our age, concerned with global warming, wonder why, has almost forgotten that early America was held in the grip of a period of intense cold known as the Little Ice Age. This severe cooling of the Earth's temperature, which lasted roughly from 1450 to 1850, had internal cycles of warmer and colder weather, and the decade from 1810 to 1820 proved to be the coldest period ever recorded in North America. Growing seasons were shortened by several weeks, and Connecticutans were required to heat their homes 8 months out of 12. To make matters worse, in 1815, the biggest volcanic eruption ever recorded took place on Mount Tambora in the Indonesian archipelago. The 400 million tons of gas released by the volcano shrouded the earth in vapor, producing in 1816 what they called the year without a summer. In New England, snow fell during every month of that year. Crops failed, and firewood, the victim of a major tree-felling hurricane that blasted through New England in 1815, was in critically short supply. The climatic crisis created an economic crisis for marginal farmers, many of whom threw in the towel in the East and joined the hopeful heading west. Some people had political reasons for leaving New England. A writer in the Worcester Spy noted that in addition to this is the quote now, the sterility of our soil and the coldness of our climate, some people were emigrating because of the overbearing oppression of the predominant party, a party who would not employ or buy of a Republican if they could possibly obtain the same of a Federalist. As a Republican in equal chance with a Federalist in this region, in commerce, at the bar, in physics, that's medicine, in divinity, or in any other profession whatever, we know they have not. Others echoed this criticism, pointing out that Connecticut's Federalist standing order, the elite subject to perpetual re-election, largely on the strength of their old and venerated family names, had used the bankruptcy and imprisonment laws that they created to enrich themselves at the expense of the state's Republicans. Calling the laws allowing for seizure of debtors' property weapons in the hands of your party to assist you in perpetuating your own power and to oppress political opponents. A Republican writer for the Hartford Times claimed that for many Republicans, emigration or imprisonment seems to be the only alternative. Federalist policy has driven Republicans to this dreadful situation. They must leave that party or leave this state. Such criticism of Connecticut as a state whose government was so hostile to political opponents that it sent them into exile raises the interesting possibility that the Western Reserve, rather than becoming a place to which Connecticut's political culture was transplanted, became rather its antithesis, a Republican stronghold espousing anti-Federalist political principles. I haven't tested this yet, but I'm hot on the trail of that one. Other motivations discussed as out-causes of migration include religious intolerance. Connecticut forced its citizens to support the established Congregational Church until 1818. That means you had to help pay for the minister whether you believed in that religion or not. And they argued that the state just had a terribly inequitable taxation policy. Connecticut laws taxed farm families as much as 70% more than those who worked in other employments. So then as now, the state's tax burden was a factor driving removal. A shortage of land, and that land exhausted. A multi-stranded environmental crisis. Political repression that spilled over into economic and social life. Religious intolerance and inequitable taxation. All these appear to have been factors behind the thousands of personal decisions made by Connecticutans in the early 1800s to pick up stakes and head west. But who went, and how, having made the decision to go to the Western Reserve, did they get there? I have at this point in my research 2 images of Connecticut's out migrants, one that's a bit too close up and another that's a bit too distant. The too close image comes from the numerous diaries, journals, and travel narratives recorded by various individuals who made the trek west and lived to publish about it. These indispensable accounts by people such as the surveyor Seth Pease, missionary Joseph Badger and Thomas Robbins, the physician Sarah Hawley, the English traveler D. Griffith, and the young woman in search of a husband, Margaret Van Horn Dwight, my favorite, give us much of the indispensable detail of the journey to and conditions in the early Western Reserve. But as good as these accounts are, and Margaret Van Horn Dwight's in particular is a classic travel narrative, they're also idiosyncratic personal records of one person's observations, one sojourner's interpretation of their own unique experience. Now, the too far image I have is a collective view of the effects of migration as revealed by the historical census data records. Their focus is hazy, but it does give us a sense of some characteristics common to the migrants as a group. The census data tells us that the population of New Connecticut, as a reserve was also known, was different in significant and important ways from that of Old Connecticut. Not surprisingly, given the effort that it took to literally begin the world anew in the wilderness, people in the Western Reserve were much younger than back home. Old Connecticut was then, as today, a graying population. More than 1 of every 6 people in Connecticut was 45 years old or older, in a time when only 1 out of 3 people could expect to reach their 60th birthday. On the Western Reserve, the number of adults over 45 was fewer than 1 in 10. Very young group. Also, unlike Old Connecticut, where women slightly outnumbered men throughout the period of migration, the Western Reserve population was skewed toward males by a ratio of 54% to 46%. In politics, this statistic would be called a landslide. For a lot of men in the Western Reserve, it was called a long, cold, lonely winter. Seeing this condition, the travel writer John Mellish urged emigrating New Englanders to take a greater portion of the blooming Yankee girls along with them and not suffer nearly 17,000 of them to pine away as old maids in their own country when it's seen they are so much wanted in this country. Another important but predictable finding of the census data is that while Connecticut's population was relatively stable, population in the Western Reserve was booming. It experienced a 236% population increase just between 1810 and 1820. How I wish I could chart that growth year by year, but the data doesn't allow for that. If the census data gives us an insight into how Connecticut's Western Reserve was taking shape demographically, the journals and diaries give us a view of what the experience of removal and resettlement was like personally. While each account is an individual one, some observations seem appropriate to all of them. To begin with, the journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became impassable mud pits, In some wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddiness by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided, as you can imagine, its own kind of hellish discomfort. The generally awful state of heavily traveled routes may help explain why many people preferred to pull their goods westward on sleds during the winter snowpack, which also is a sign of just how cold that period was. The would-be emigrant had choice of two possible routes to the reserve. Geographer Bill Keegan, using the accounts of several early migrants, has created a map that shows travelers' options. A northern route went up the Mohawk Valley and crossed New York to Buffalo. There a choice had to be made between travel by boat along Lake Erie's southern shore, a very choppy trip, or to continue to follow the rugged trail along the lake shore on land. The southern route crossed Pennsylvania along the old Forbes Road, cut during the French and Indian War, crossed the mountains into Pittsburgh, and then followed trails into the reserve at Youngstown. Neither of the routes was a cakewalk, and neither offered significant advantages over the other in time or distance. Although there was significant variation in the duration of individual journeys, travelers seem to have averaged 12 to 15 miles a day, less when crossing mountains, more when the weather was good and the terrain flat and dry. 6 weeks seemed to have been the average, though as transportation improvements such as canals and better roads came into play near the end of the period, travel time to the reserve seems to have decreased. A determined Zira Hawley made the journey to Ohio in only 23 days in 1820. The Reverend Joseph Badger, who would stop and preach to anyone, including squirrels and badgers along the way, took over 4 months. No matter how long the journey took, it was an experience no traveler would ever forget. In addition to the not inconsiderable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled streams and rivers, and climbing and descending high mountain passes, migrants experienced inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow travelers, and fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. Henry Leavitt Ellsworth, who would go on to become the first commissioner of patents in the United States, sought to procure for himself some instruments of death prior to leaving Connecticut to protect himself from the rare but not unknown incidents of highway robbery. For many of the Connecticut migrants who had lived their entire lives among the incredibly homogeneous and undiverse population of the Nutmeg State, the journey west produced their first exposure to groups of people who were different in language, culture, and values than they were. Many found this contact disconcerting, some found it offensive and frightening. Consider, for example, the prim and proper Margaret Van Horn White's description of the Germans she encountered violating Connecticut's time-honored conventions for Sunday deportment, the Blue Laws, at an inn in Hanover, Pennsylvania in 1810. I should not have thought it possible to pass a Sabbath in our country among such a dissolute, vicious set of wretches as we are now among. I believe at least 50 Dutchmen have been here today to smoke, drink, swear, pitch, sense, almost dance, laugh, and talk Dutch and stare at us. They come in droves, young and old, black and white, women and children. It's dreadful to see so many people that you cannot speak to or understand. Sorry, I get carried away. But if the road west brought migrants significant exposure to things previously unknown, it's also clear that they were never far removed from some connection to the state from which they'd left. For all along the way, in town after town after little town, many of which are now all but forgotten, migrants reported encountering people they'd known in or who came from Connecticut, but who now resided in this or that way station on the slow journey west. The roads to the Western Reserve, particularly the northern routes, were studded with Connecticutans who, like themselves, had chosen to seek their fortunes in the West, just not as far as the Western Reserve. Were these people who had started out for Ohio and found other possibilities along the way? Had they found the road west a road too far, or found better opportunities closer to their original home? Maybe time and research will tell, but for now all I can say is that the tens of thousands of Connecticut natives who started out for New Connecticut in the early 1800s found thousands of fellow former nutmeggers along the way with whom they shared what many of them identified as a very useful bond of common origins. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, maybe the younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. And some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret White's comment to her journal on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we are beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country lest I should be known. And so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains, and then I'm sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding in the wagons so she wouldn't be recognized. This is an aspect about migration that we rarely see or even think about. And it complicates our jingoistic views so common of Anglos hot in the pursuit of manifest destiny. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with mixed emotions. But how did those who stayed behind view their leader? In most cases, Connecticutans, at least those not involved in promoting the sale of the Western lands, viewed the outmigration with grave concern. One observer lamented that Connecticut's population had been kept down and attributed to the fact that migration from Connecticut must have ratably exceeded the migration from any of the other states. The effect of the 50,000 New Englanders who have for a number of years passed annually over the Alleghenies led another writer to bemoan the severe decline of New England's political clout in favor of the new states. Other Connecticutans saw outmigration producing not just a youth drain, but a serious capital outflow as well. The property that's carried out by this constant stream of migration, wrote one, can't be much, if any, less than $1 million yearly, which waste is not repaired. Worse than the loss of capital was the outmigrants' potential loss of humanity. More than a few critics harkened back to the old Puritan fears of what they called Creolean degeneracy, the likely possibility that settlers living in a wilderness environment would lose their civilized qualities and return to a savage state of nature. The transition from civilization to savageness is much easier than from the latter to the former, warned a Hartford Courant commentator. He warned of a population of millions of our own color, flesh, and blood, who lived without schools, without a ministry, without religious institutes, without the Sabbath, without Bibles, sunk and still sinking into the depths of moral debasement. Another writer, who styled himself only a Connecticut farmer, urged those thinking of leaving to reconsider before it was too late. Few, very few, I believe, of those who have sold the inheritance of their fathers to improve their fortunes in the wilds have fully counted the cost of their undertaking. For myself, he said, I love my native state, I reverence her laws, her religion, her morals, and her habits, and would not exchange them for the minds of Peru. I love my state too, and like the man who called himself a Connecticut farmer in 1818, I lament the loss of our state's young people today, just as he lamented those thousands on the road in the early 1800s. And I hope that, like Connecticut in 1820, we'll find that next industrial revolution. Connecticut turned itself in less than half a century into an industrial colossus, and Hartford became the richest city in America. It did it with running water. What's it going to take now? I don't know. But like you, I hope we find it, because the trip to see my grandkids is long, and the phone calls with the children aren't nearly as nice as sitting down to dinner. So that's the way it was in 1820. That's the way it is today. And if you'd like to learn more, there's a wonderful exhibit at the Litchfield Historical Society. It opens next Friday and runs for the next year. And I really thank you for coming out tonight. It was a hot day. And I must say, I've told you every single thing I know about the Western Reserve. So you can ask me any question you want to now, and I'll make up something as cool as I can. Yeah.
I heard that a lot of people left because when the Ohio territories opened up, I think a lot of Revolutionary War veterans were giving land grants by Congress. So Congress didn't have any money. They said, you got a chunk of land out there for you. Plus there's no rocks in the dirt.
Right.
I'm telling you, the rocks is absolutely true.
Okay.
The soil in Northeast Ohio, when you dig into it, it's black loam, or loam. I guess they call it loam in Connecticut. It's just wonderful soil, and yeah, it was an ocean bed. It is not rocky. And it's interesting. I talked about the Western Reserve, but there was another part of Northeast Ohio that went from Cleveland over to Toledo, so about the same size moving west. That was called the Firelands. And Connecticut kept that land too, to give to people in Connecticut whose property had been burned out by the British during the Revolutionary War. At three different times during the Revolution, the British came along the coast. They invaded New Haven. They did the Fairfield, towns along the shore. And the people who were victimized by those raids, they got, during the Revolution, as part of their damage settlement, their FEMA settlement was to get a certificate of land in the Western Reserve. Now, at the time, the land was way too far away. It was owned by indigenous people who were fighting like hell to keep it, and there was not much of a market for it. So people who got those land certificates, many of them ended up being sold to land speculators who held on to them until the land's cleared up, and they profited from them. But still, some of the more adventurous ones, and there were thousands, went to what is called the Firelands, which is just west of the Western Reserve, and they kept that Connecticut connection going all across northern Ohio. But what you see, both if you visit there and if you live there, is that the farther west you go, the less like Connecticut it seems. It's like a watercolor that fades as you go. But that's just how it looks. What was it like? I don't know. That'll be book 3.
Yeah, right.
But great question, thank you. Yeah.
You mentioned that some of the money from the sales or settlements went into the Connecticut education.
Yeah.
Now you would think that would enhance education in Connecticut, but didn't it have a negative impact? Because a lot of towns like Markhampton said, well, there's this big fund, we don't need to support education local.
That's exactly right. For many years, towns would not support education because they said the state has a school fund, let the school fund support the schools. And this became an issue. The school fund lasted, I think, into the 20th century. And finally, the General Assembly folded it into the general fund. What a surprise. And, fine. But you're absolutely right. My predecessor, a state historian, Christopher Collier, wrote a wonderful book about education in Connecticut where he talks about this very problem. Something that was meant to give Connecticut the best public education in the country. The unintended consequence was local towns decided that they didn't have to fund education in their own places, and it held education back. So, two really good questions. I may have to move to Barkhamsted.
My ancestors were originally settling Simsbury, and then suddenly they left, and they ended up in a place called Mexico, New York, which must have been part of that Mohawk
It
Trail.
might have been part of, yeah.
Where can I get more information about that particular migration or
Well,
emigration?
It's not that far. You can go to the towns of Troy and Utica.
Okay.
Utica, New York started out as New Hartford. Was settled by Connecticut people. A lot of these towns, especially along the Erie Canal towns, they have the same kind of deep Connecticut roots.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the most moving thing in all my research in the Western Reserve was a packet of letters I found, maybe 20 letters, that was written between 3 or 4 women who originally lived in Middlefield. They were related to each other. And these letters spanned from the early 1800s, when a couple of them were classmates at a school in Wethersfield, to 1870. Their letters back and forth, all of them, one stayed in Middlefield, the other ones moved west. And they're cousins, they write, these women are trying desperately to use letters to keep their extended families together. And you can see how much they miss each other, how much this is over 6 or 7 generations. They grow old together by mail. And when, the family, it's the story of westward migration in America, sons who go west and, die in a railroad accident someplace in Illinois, or just buried right where they died. Heart-wrenching stories of people trying to keep those ties of family through this vast westward movement. Those stories are in the towns and historical societies that go from here to Buffalo and that go from here to Ohio. And in all the towns in Ohio, I have long wished, and I've been promoting this as part of working on this exhibit, that every Connecticut town that has a sister town in Ohio or Pennsylvania or New York would get together, and the historical societies get together, share information, and have an Old Home Week that went both ways, right? So that we could explore each other's archives, share each other's information, and get a new sense of, just how different and how very similar life was now 2 centuries ago, hard to believe. Sorry, that's, as you can see, that's my thing. So if you guys want to do it, I'll lead the charge. Or actually, I'll get behind you and push you.
Good ideas.
So thank you so much. It's wonderful of you to come.